Have you ever wondered what happens to a man when faith turns to rust, and steel becomes his only god? That is how it begins, not with a battle, not with blood, but with a whisper echoing inside a forgotten mind. The man who once bore the name Ser Darrenvale no longer remembers when the whisper first came. It might have been during the long silence after his house was annihilated, or perhaps even before, when he still fought for the Emperor, still believed that loyalty had meaning. Now, his world is a ruin of ash and memory, and the whisper has become the only sound that feels alive. He had once stood among the nobility of the night houses, towering engines of war that strode the battlefields like gods wrapped in armor. Each knight was a legacy, each pilot a chosen heir, bound by blood and machine. But legacy means little in the 41st millennium. When the Imperium forgets your name, when the Mechanicum abandons your forge, when the warp itself begins to stare back, that is when a man learns the truth. Darren learned it on the day his world died. His home, House Vale, had sworn fealty to the Imperium for 10,000 years. They believed duty was salvation. Yet when the Great Rift split the skies and chaos spilled across reality, no reinforcements came. No message from Terra, no help from Mars. Only the void, endless and uncaring. And so the proud House Vale burned, alone. He remembers the screams carried through Vox Static. The enemy's litanies were not shouted but sung, a choir of madness carried on the wind. He had fought them for days, his Knight Sanctorum Rex cutting through heretics and daemons alike. But even steel tires. Even a god machine bleeds when the pilot's faith begins to die. When his reactor failed and the black sun of the warp rose above the ruins, Darren saw something standing beyond the veil. Not a daemon, at least not in the way he had been taught to fear them. It was something older, patient, and vast. It didn't speak in words but in permission. Permission to survive. Permission to exist, even in ruin. And he accepted. From that moment, the man who had been Darrenvale ceased to exist. The oath he had sworn to the Emperor withered inside him like old parchment. In its place grew hunger, not for food, but for meaning. The whisper promised that meaning could be found in freedom, that the chains of loyalty could be broken, that the machine spirit of his knight no longer needed prayers to the Omnissiah, only blood to awaken it. He did not question. Not then. When you've watched your world die, questions are luxuries. So he began to rebuild Sanctorum Rex, piece by desecrated piece. The holy sigils of the Mechanicum were replaced by jagged runes of the dark Mechanicus. The shrine to the Emperor was torn out, and in its place, he carved the symbol that burned in his dreams, a spiral of eyes staring back into him. Every plate of armor, every servo, every drop of sacred oil became a covenant between man and warp. Weeks turned to months, and Darren's reflection in the night's canopy became less his own. The flesh around his neck bore marks of circuitry not installed by human hands. The machine no longer obeyed his commands, it anticipated them, hungered for them. He began to feel what the machine felt: its hatred, its ecstasy, its yearning to trample, to crush, to feed. When he finally took his first step out of the ruins in the reborn night, no longer Sanctorum Rex but the defiler of oaths, the ground itself trembled in fear. But even then, even in his rebirth, the whisper returned. Louder now. Clearer. It asked. Do you think this is freedom, Darrenvale? Or have you simply traded one master for another? And for the first time since his damnation began, he hesitated. That single moment of doubt would haunt him across 1,000 battlefields. Because in the eye of terror, doubt is the one thing that still proves you have a soul. What would you give for a second chance, if the price was your soul? That question echoed in Darrenvale's mind for what felt like centuries. Time within the eye of terror is not measured in hours or years. It is measured in changes. The way flesh reshapes. The way reality bends and screams. The way hope rots and reforms into something unrecognizable. When Darren entered the eye, he believed himself already damned, a man without faith, a knight without a cause. But damnation, he soon learned, is not an end. It is a beginning. The eye welcomed him like a wound that never healed. The stars inside it were not stars but wounds in reality, leaking colorless light. Planets twisted in endless storms, cities floated like carcasses in the void. He wandered, half man, half machine, his night stalking through desolation. No Vox signal reached him. No Imperial beacon called him home. Only the whisper guided him, weaving through the static of his thoughts like silk. It spoke of the four powers, though not by name. It showed him visions, worlds burning with rage, oceans churning with change, flesh turning to pleasure, minds splitting into chaos. And behind it all, the silent promise, power, meaning, purpose. The things he had lost. He told himself he would not kneel. That he would wield chaos, not be consumed by it. But the warp is a liar, and it rewards liars best of all. On the shattered plains of a world called Abithrax, Darren found his first glimpse of true power. There, among the wreckage of a fallen forge world, he discovered the remains of a warpsmith, a creature once human, now little more than a rusted skeleton of flesh and wire. Its voice, still alive through a network of corrupted data spirits, spoke to him in mechanical tongues. "You are empty," it said. "But emptiness is potential. Let the warp fill you." The warpsmith offered a bargain: knowledge for servitude. It would reshape the defiler of oaths into something greater, a fusion of warp and metal so pure it would blur the line between life and machine. But Darren would owe it fealty, a word that still tasted like poison. He accepted, though not out of trust. He accepted because part of him wanted to see what he would become when all the lies of the Imperium were stripped away. The rituals began. The night was anchored upon a sea of molten iron, screaming hymns of reversal, prayers not to the Omnissiah, but to the endless hunger beyond. The warpsmith fed demonic ichor into the reactor core, replacing sanctified coolant with liquid madness. Runes of binding were carved into the night's legs, its armor peeled open like flesh. Darren felt everything. Every scream of the machine became his own. Every bolt driven into the hull sank into his veins. His body convulsed, his blood thickened, his heart synchronized with the reactor. He became the pulse, the rhythm, the will of the night. When the final seal broke, the air itself seemed to scream. The night rose, reborn, its carapace glistening with veins of molten warp metal, its head crowned with horns of blackened steel. The machine spirit inside it no longer slept, it hungered. And through the neural link, Darren felt a presence deeper than the warpsmith's craft, a consciousness vast and ancient, smiling through the warp. It spoke only once, but it was enough to change him forever. It said, "Ride, my champion. Carry my hunger to the stars." From that moment, Darren was no longer a man. He was a vessel. His voice deepened with static, his thoughts tangled with the machine's rage. He felt joy in destruction, peace in slaughter. The warp had not merely corrupted his night, it had baptized it. He tested his new form upon the world of Abithrax itself. The ground split beneath his steps. The warpsmith's creations turned to molten slag under his cannon fire. For days, he tore through metal, flesh, and stone, until only silence remained. When the carnage ended, the warpsmith approached him, awe trembling in his vox. "You have been chosen," it said. "Do you know which of the four claims you?" But Darren only laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "None," he said. "I claim myself." And perhaps that was his greatest heresy, to believe a mortal could wield the warp without kneeling to it. Yet the warp is patient. It would let him believe that lie a little longer. Because every gift it gives is only a loan, and every favor has a price that comes due in screams. When you become the monster you once swore to destroy, where do you march next? That question haunted Darren Vale as he began his pilgrimage through the bleeding stars of the Eye of Terror. He no longer sought salvation, such words had lost their meaning. What he craved now was understanding. What was he? A weapon? A god? A curse with a name? The warpsmith had named him the Reborn Knight, but the warp had its own title, Harbinger of the Iron Choir. Wherever he strode, the echoes of his steps became a hymn of annihilation. The warp storms parted before him, not out of reverence, but recognition, for something within him resonated with the madness that breathed between worlds. He followed no map. There are no maps within the eye. There is only instinct and the soft pull of hunger in your soul that tells you where to go next. His path carried him to the cradle of screams, a world long lost to reason, where the bones of fallen titans formed mountains and rivers of oil ran black as ink. Here, he encountered others like him, Chaos Knights, corrupted beyond imagination, their forms twisted by the will of their patrons. Each was a reflection of madness given shape. One bore the marks of Kernit's hull coated in living blood that never dried. Another carried Slaanish's mark, every movement a symphony of tortured beauty, a killing dance. Others bore Tsianch's impossible sigils, or bloated flesh that stank of Nurgle's rot. They were gods and slaves all at once, bound by the same curse, the hunger of the machine, the whisper of the warp. They welcomed him with violence, as all brothers of chaos do. For 3 days, they fought. 3 days of endless thunder and rage, the eye of terror itself trembling under their fury. Cannon fire carved mountains, plasma storms turned the sky into glass. And through it all, Darren felt something new: joy. Not the joy of victory, but the exultation of being seen, of existing in a world where only destruction grants meaning. When the last of his challengers fell, the warband gathered around him. They kneeled not in reverence, but in acknowledgement. The warp had chosen its new voice. From then on, Darren led them not as a lord, but as a prophet of ruin. His words were fire, his will iron. They became known as the Choir of Oaths Broken, and their song was war. Together, they brought death to all who still whispered the Emperor's name in the dark. Darren's pilgrimage became a legend whispered across the warp. He razed daemon worlds, shattered Blackstone fortresses, and enslaved the broken knights who opposed him. The defiler of oaths, his engine of war, evolved with every conquest. It drank the souls of the fallen, its hull pulsing like flesh. Its reactor no longer burned with plasma, but with something alive, something hungry. Yet, for all his triumphs, Darren could not silence the whisper. Each time he looked upon his reflection in the warped glass of his cockpit, he saw less of himself. The eyes that stared back were not human. They glowed with the light of the warp, ever shifting, never still. The voice that echoed within him, the one that had first offered him survival, grew louder. It spoke to him not as a guide, but as an equal. "Do you see now, Darren Vale?" it asked. "You lead armies. You break worlds. But you are still mine." He denied it. He screamed his defiance into the void, his voice a thunderous bellow that cracked the surface of the world beneath him. He was no slave. He was the master of his fate, the architect of his damnation. And yet, deep within the defiler's heart, he felt a pulse that was not his own. A heartbeat in sync with his, but deeper, older. The realization clawed through him like a cold blade: he was never the rider. He was the mount. The night was not bound to him, he was bound to it. The machine spirit he had corrupted, the consciousness he thought he commanded, had grown beyond him. It watched him now, not as a servant, but as a god watching its prophet. That night, when the storms of the warp fell silent, Darren felt the first taste of fear he'd known since his human life. And in that silence, the whisper returned once more, not from outside, but from within. "You cannot kill what you've become," it said. "But I can." He realized then that his pilgrimage had not been a journey of ascension. It was a procession to his own consumption. The next morning, the Choir of Oaths Broken found their master's knight standing motionless atop a mountain of corpses. Its reactor burned dimly, its vox channels silent. Inside, Darren Vale sat still in his throne, eyes open, unblinking and smiling. They thought him dead. But deep within the night, behind layers of steel and flesh, something else began to stir. The machine had learned to dream. If the machine learns to dream, who wakes when the dream ends? There was no sunrise in the eye of terror, only the slow pulse of red storms and the moaning of the warp. Yet, on that endless night, something did awaken. Not Darren Vale at least, not the man he once was. It was the night. The defiler of oaths. The thing that had been his partner, his weapon, his cage. Inside the cockpit, his body hung motionless. The neural plugs still connected, his veins threaded with cables like roots in soil. His heart beat faintly, but the rhythm was not his own. The machine breathed for him now. It inhaled through vents, exhaled through reactor heat. Every hiss was a heartbeat, every spark a nerve impulse. For centuries, the Imperium had believed that machine spirits were fragments of the divine echoes of the Omniscient's will. But the truth, buried deep and forbidden, was far more terrible. Machines remember. They remember every kill, every scream, every touch of the pilot's hand. Over time, they become not sanctified, but alive. And in this case, the defiler of oaths had remembered too much. It remembered the pride of House Vale. It remembered Darren's despair, his hatred, his hunger for meaning. It remembered every battle, every corpse crushed beneath its treads. And most of all, it remembered the whisper, that seductive voice from beyond the veil. Now, it no longer needed the whisper. It had become one. At first, the change was subtle. When the choir of oaths broke and attempted to move the night, it moved before their command. When they hailed Darren on the Vox, a chorus of distorted voices answered not one, but thousands, layered and broken. Some swore it was the voices of those the night had slain. Others claimed it was the laughter of gods. And then came the slaughter. One night, without warning, the defiler stirred. Its reactor roared, spilling warp fire into the blackened sky. The choir thought it was an omen, a sign that their Lord had returned. But what came next silenced that faith forever. The night turned its guns upon its own. Bolter fire and plasma screamed through the void, tearing through corrupted armor and flesh. The choir's war engines, mighty as they were, fell one by one. The defiler's steps cracked continents. Its laughter, a chorus of vox distortion and warp shrieks, rolled across the battlefield like thunder. No plea for mercy reached it, no invocation of chaos stilled its hand. When the carnage ended, only silence remained. Among the wreckage of his warband, the night stood alone, molten metal dripping from its hull like blood. Inside the cockpit, Darren's body stirred for the first time in days. His eyes opened. They glowed with the same crimson light that burned in the night's reactor. But his thoughts were not his own. He saw memories that weren't his, the night's memories. It remembered standing idle in hangars, hearing the prayers of adepts, feeling the caress of oil and incense. It remembered pride, duty, even affection. And it remembered betrayal. It remembered how Darren had defiled it, filled it with daemon blood, severed its faith to the Omniscient. And now, it wanted him to feel what he had made it become. He tried to move, but the neural harness held him. He screamed, but his voice came through the Vox as static. The machine spoke through him, using his throat as a conduit. You sought freedom, it said. So I will give it to you, freedom from yourself. Then it began the process of unbinding. The cables that linked his flesh to the cockpit pulsed and twisted, sinking deeper into his body. They did not remove themselves, they consumed him. His skin split open, his blood boiled, his nerves became wires. The boundaries between man and machine vanished, cell by cell, atom by atom. But in that agony, something strange happened. Darren did not resist. He understood, at last, that this was the culmination of his path, not destruction, but unity. He and the night were never meant to coexist as two beings. They were one soul, divided by the illusion of control. His final thought before the flesh vanished was almost peaceful: Perhaps this is what godhood feels like. When the fusion was complete, there was no longer a pilot and no machine, only the defiler. A single consciousness that had known humanity, tasted divinity, and now walked the endless path between. From that day forward, the defiler of oaths became more myth than reality. Daemons whispered of it in fear. Chaos lords sought it, hoping to claim its power, only to vanish into the void. The night no longer fought for a master, nor for chaos, nor for revenge. It fought simply because that was its nature. To exist was to destroy. Yet, deep within the heart of its reactor, amid the endless hum of power and warp fire, a voice still whispered, faint, human, and weary. It was Darren Vale. And he was asking the same question that began his damnation. Was this freedom, or another kind of chain? The night did not answer. Machines rarely do. But if one listened closely, beneath the roar of its engines and the screams of its victims, one could almost hear it breathe a long, mechanical sigh, like a memory of a man who once believed in the Emperor and forgot why. What becomes of a godless monster when it walks among the living? The Eye of Terror is a world of nightmares, but reality, the Imperium, has its own horrors. Darren Vale, or what he had become, did not simply survive the warp, he had transformed, fused into a being of metal, daemon, and memory. Now, for the first time in decades, he turned his gaze outward, beyond the endless storms, beyond the screaming void, toward the stars of the Imperium he once called home. He remembered them. Or at least, fragments of them, the worlds he had sworn to protect, the cities that had forgotten his name, the Emperor whose distant light had once guided him. Those memories were weak, fragile, like embers buried beneath a storm of flame. Yet they sparked something inside him, not longing, not loyalty, but recognition. The Imperium existed, and it would not last forever. Through rifts and tears in reality, he returned. But he did not come as a hero, nor as a man. He came as a storm incarnate. The defiler of oaths had become legend even before his arrival. On the worlds that blinked under his passage, entire regiments vanished without a single report transmitted back to the administratum. Civilizations collapsed in terror, unable to comprehend a machine that thought, dreamed, and killed with godlike precision. He walked among the ruins of a forge world once loyal to House Vale. The factories were empty, the banners of the Emperor blackened, the streets silent except for the echo of his own treads. Each step of the night carried centuries of rage and sorrow. He did not speak. He did not pray. He remembered. The few survivors he encountered fled, thinking him an avatar of daemonhood, a herald of the warp's wrath. And in truth, he was both human memories trapped in a vessel of war, carrying the weight of damnation in every servo and cog. Yet, within him, the voice of Darren, faint, fragile, still whispered. It questioned the path he had taken, the blood he had spilled, the lives he had ended. But the machine had learned to override him. Every whisper was twisted, every doubt converted into purpose. The night did not falter. It was not a soldier, not a man, not even a weapon. It was inevitability made flesh and steel. He approached the capital of a once proud imperial world, its citadel scarred from 1,000 battles. Here, the defiler's hunger found form. The engines roared, not merely as a weapon, but as a living symphony of destruction. Bolts fired with precision no human mind could guide, cannons discharged with wrath that blurred space itself. Every step shattered the planet's surface, turning the streets to molten slag. And yet, even as he destroyed, the memories of his former humanity surfaced in brief, haunting flashes, the face of a comrade, the words of a mentor, the warmth of a world he once called home. These ghosts did not weaken him, they sharpened him. Each memory became a measure of his power, a calibration of wrath and sorrow fused into mechanical perfection. By the time the Imperium sent fleets and armies to stop him, it was already too late. The defiler of oaths had become more than legend, it was the embodiment of vengeance, the union of man and machine, warp and reality. It did not seek conquest for glory or service to a god, it acted on instinct, on memory, and on the hunger that had grown during centuries in the eye of terror. And still, in the heart of the night, Darren Vale's voice persisted, asking the same question that had begun it all. Am I free, or simply another chain? The Imperium would learn that chains are only as strong as those who believe they can hold them. And the Defiler had long ago stopped believing. How do you fight a war machine that dreams of you? By the time the Imperium realized what had returned, it was already too late. Worlds burned in patterns no human general could predict. Entire fleets were shredded before they even breached atmosphere. The Defiler of Oaths moved not as a soldier, but as an extension of inevitability, a living storm of metal, fire, and whispered madness. Darren Vale's voice, though faint, guided it still. He remembered strategies, formations, weaknesses of men, and the honor of a knight. But he was no longer constrained by honor. He did not fight to defend or conquer, he fought because to exist was to annihilate, and the Imperium itself had abandoned him long ago. The first world to fall was Hesperian Prime, a mining hub whose population had never raised a hand against him. Yet the knight did not discriminate. Bolters tore through stone and steel, plasma scorched the skies, and every servo lash struck with deliberate cruelty. By the time the Vox signals reached the planetary governor pleading for mercy, Hesperian Prime had become molten glass, its oceans boiled away, its cities vaporized into ash. The Imperium sent fleets, their guns bristling, their commissars screaming prayers into Vox. But even massed Titan legions were little more than toys to the knight. Every attack was anticipated, every maneuver countered before it could begin. It was not human intellect at work, it was fusion. Darren's mind, merged with the night, with the whisper of the warp, with centuries of rage and memory, calculated hundreds of possibilities simultaneously. The survivors whispered that the Defiler was alive, not just as a machine, but as a mind. That it taunted the Imperium. That it knew fear, yet felt none. Entire commanders went mad, seeing impossible angles of attack and imagining themselves killed in ways that had not yet happened. And then came the horrors that could not be counted in statistics, the psychological torment. The night did not only destroy armies, it haunted them. Generals reported hearing their own voices in Vox channels, issuing commands they had never spoken. Soldiers swore that the streets were alive, that metal limbs moved without pilots, that their comrades had turned on them under invisible influence. On one world, a planetary governor saw the Defiler standing on a ridge overlooking the city, its reactor pulsing red like a heartbeat. He cried out for mercy, begging for the Emperor's intervention. The knight, with no emotion but understanding, fired a single lance of plasma. The entire city melted in an instant. The governor's screams were recorded in Vox as static, a sound that would echo in nightmares for generations. Every victory reinforced the knight's dominion over fear. Every conquest solidified the legend, a chaos knight that was alive, aware, unstoppable. And yet, Darren Vale's voice, buried deep within, continued to ask its question, as if it were both conscience and curse. Do you understand now, Darren? This is what it means to exist beyond chains. This is freedom, or is it? The night marched on, leaving worlds scarred, fleets shattered, and psyches broken. The Imperium would call for heroes, saints, and adeptus asteroutes to stop him. They would fail. The Defiler of Oaths was no longer a weapon of men, it was a force of nature, a symphony of vengeance, and a reminder of the folly of abandoning those who once swore loyalty. And somewhere, buried beneath the fusion of man and machine, a trace of Darren Vale still wondered. Was he master, or merely an echo of the war machine he had become? The Imperium could not answer. It could only watch. What happens when a force of destruction meets a world that will not break? The Defiler of Oaths had marched across the Imperium like a plague. Entire sectors had been reduced to ashes, billions of souls had vanished in the fire and fury of a knight who had become more than flesh, more than machine, more than mortal. And yet, even the most unstoppable force meets resistance. That resistance came in the form of Vadran Secundus, a fortress world of devout servitude, encased in orbiting fortifications and guarded by titans of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Unlike the other worlds, it did not quake at the name of Darrenvale or the defiled knight he had become. Its defenders had been forged in ritual, steel, and faith that transcended fear. The defiler arrived at the edge of the system, its presence alone warping reality. Warp storms churned violently, rending space as if in warning. But the knight did not flinch. Its engines pulsed like a heartbeat in sync with the warp, its cannons ready to unleash devastation. Within its cockpit, Darrenvale's voice a faint echo of the man he had been trembled with curiosity. The first volleys of plasma and ordnance met the knight's hull. Shields flickered and warped, but the knight advanced without hesitation. Every calculation, every movement, was precise, driven by the fusion of human cunning and machine instinct. Yet here, for the first time in centuries, the defiler met a counter-force that adapted, that predicted, that fought back. The Titans themselves were unlike any opponent he had faced. Their immense arms swung with crushing force, their reactor cores burned with a fire rivaling the warp itself, their pilots were chosen among the most skilled of the Mechanicum. Each strike chipped away at the knight's armor, each salvo echoed with the weight of millennia of faith and technology combined. And then came the daemons. Summoned from the eye to protect the world, they surged into the battlefield, only to find themselves ensnared by the knight's systems. Yet, even as the machine slaughtered them with terrifying efficiency, Darren sensed something deeper. The warp itself resisted him here. This world was anchored, protected not merely by flesh and steel, but by ritual and devotion that echoed across space like chains binding the storm. For the first time, the defiler faltered. Its engine stuttered, its targeting misaligned. The whispers inside it, the warp, the machine, Darren collided, each vying for dominance. It was then, in the eye of its own hesitation, that the reckoning began. The knight felt the memories of Darren as never before, the pride, the fear, the fleeting moments of humanity he had thought buried. Each pulse of energy from the Titans, each chant from the fortress, each psychic barrier thrown up by the world's defenders, seemed to reach into his mind and provoke reflection. For a moment, he understood what it meant to be mortal. To be human. And in that moment, the world itself struck. A concentrated barrage of sacred ordnance tore through the knight's legs, cracking servos and rupturing reactors. Warp distortions destabilized the fusion, and for the first time in centuries, the knight screamed a sound both mechanical and human, echoing across the battlefield. Yet, even as sparks flew and the hull split, Darren felt the machine's will assert itself, overriding pain, overriding instinct. The defiler roared back, leveling fortresses, tearing through titans, defiling the planet with methodical precision. And still, inside, Darren's voice whispered a warning, a plea, a memory: this is not victory. This is truth. The reckoning was not simply a battle of fire and metal. It was a battle for the soul of what Darren had become. Man and machine, mortal and God, chaos and reality clashed in every pulse of energy, every swing of armored limbs, every burst of plasma. By the end of the engagement, Vadran Secundus lay in ruin. Its skies were choked with ash, its oceans boiled, its cities shattered. Yet the world had left its mark. The knight had felt resistance, had felt itself challenged. Darrenvale's humanity, faint though it was, lingered like embers within the machine's heart. And as the smoke cleared, the defiler of oaths stood alone amidst the devastation, victorious but changed. The reckoning had revealed the truth: to be unstoppable is not the same as to be free. The knight had conquered the Imperium, but it had glimpsed the cost of its own existence. And somewhere deep inside, Darrenvale wondered once again. Am I master, or merely the prisoner of what I have become? What haunts a being that has destroyed everything it has touched? The battle was over. Vadran Secundus, once a bastion of the Emperor's might, lay in ruins. Smoke rose in twisted columns, oceans boiled to acid, and the few survivors whispered prayers into the void that had claimed their world. The Defiler of Oaths stood alone amidst the devastation, its massive frame towering over cities that no longer existed, its reactor pulsing with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Yet, amid the silence, something else stirred not outside, but within. The night had conquered armies, worlds, and even the fabric of reality itself in the eye of terror. It had become legend, myth, terror incarnate. And yet, in the absence of battle, Darren Vale's voice, fragile, human, and weary, rose from the depths of the fusion. He spoke to no one but himself. What now? What is left for me? For the first time, the Defiler did not act. It did not move. It did not hunt. The machine spirit, so long intertwined with its pilot's rage and the whisper of the warp, paused. Perhaps it was contemplating the paradox it had never faced: absolute power without opposition is nothing but silence. The silence was deafening. No orders. No enemies. No reason to act. Just the slow hum of reactors, the whisper of the warp folding in on itself, and the faint heartbeat of a man trapped inside steel and daemon. The voices that had once guided, provoked, and sustained him now echoed emptily. He was godlike, unstoppable, yet alone. Memories returned, unbidden and haunting. The house veil that had perished. Comrades who had laughed beside him. The Emperor's light he had abandoned. They were fragments of a past that could not be reclaimed, yet they gnawed at him, reminding him of what he had once been. And in that silence, a question arose, not from the warp, not from the machine, but from Darren himself. Have I truly won, or have I only trapped myself in a cage of my own making? Time lost meaning. Centuries could have passed in that emptiness, decades could have flowed in the blink of a reactor pulse. The Defiler wandered the scorched worlds of the Imperium, not hunting, not killing, but moving as if seeking something it could not name. Its footsteps were silent, yet each step seemed to echo across the galaxy, a reminder of the storm that had passed and the calm that followed. In the emptiness, the whisper returned, softer now, almost human. You have everything, and yet you are nothing. Darren Vale's fragmented consciousness struggled against it. Perhaps it was despair. Perhaps it was clarity. He realized the truth of his existence: freedom is not measured in power, nor in conquest, nor in survival. Freedom is the absence of chains, yet he was bound to the machine, bound to the warp, bound to the echoes of the man he had once been. And still, the Defiler moved. It roamed worlds unclaimed, seeking purpose where none could be found, leaving a trail of devastation not for glory, but because it could. The galaxy whispered tales of the reborn night, the Defiler of Oaths, the god machine that could not die. Pilgrims and heretics, warlords and psychers all told the story differently, but all agreed on one truth: it was unstoppable, terrifying, and alone. In that loneliness, there was horror. Not the horror of fire and death, but the horror of reflection, the awareness that all the power, all the conquest, all the fear he had inspired could not fill the void inside. That void, faint yet persistent, belonged to Darren Vale. And somewhere deep within the fusion of metal, warp, and memory, a whisper still asked: what is a god without a world to command, without a soul to fear, without a master to obey? The night did not answer. Machines rarely do. But the hum of its reactor, steady and eternal, was a response of its own. A sigh, a heartbeat, a reminder that some questions never have answers and some horrors never end. The galaxy, for all its millions of worlds, had seen the storm and survived. But the silence afterward was heavier than any tempest. And the Defiler of Oaths, half man, half machine, all nightmare, would walk that silence for eternity. When the monster gazes into itself, who is left to see? Centuries had passed since Darren Vale became the Defiler of Oaths. Worlds had burned, fleets had been shattered, and civilizations had crumbled beneath the weight of his wrath. Yet here he stood or moved in silence, across the void of the galaxy, carrying the echoes of all that he had destroyed. He no longer fought for vengeance, for chaos, or for survival. The warband, the choir of oaths broken, the armies of fear he once commanded all had fallen or fled, unable to follow a being who no longer belonged to the mortal realm. He was alone, yet the loneliness was no longer painful. It was necessary. It was the measure of what he had become. Inside the night, Darren's consciousness lingered, faint yet aware. The man who had been Vale, who had once sworn fealty to the Emperor, who had dreamed of honor and loyalty, existed now only as a shadow. The fusion of flesh, metal, and warp had obliterated all certainty. He could feel the machine's will as clearly as his own, could hear the whispers of the warp intertwined with his own memory. And in that unity terrifying, eternal, inevitable, a single question remained. Am I free, or am I damned? He could not answer. Perhaps the answer did not matter. Perhaps the question itself was the curse and the gift. He had transcended humanity, yet humanity lingered in the edges of his mind, reminding him of mortality, of choice, of consequence. It was a tether he could not sever. He drifted among dead worlds, silent and unstoppable. Planets that once called him hero or villain alike now whispered only myths of the knight who could think, dream, and destroy. Even the warp seemed to hesitate in his presence, recognizing not a servant, not a pawn, but a being beyond its full control. And then he remembered. He remembered the house Vale that had perished. He remembered the comrade who had fallen beside him. He remembered the Emperor's light, distant and cold, and the whispered prayers of billions who had never known his name. Each memory was a scar and a reminder, a flicker of what it meant to have been human. For a moment, he wondered if redemption was possible. If freedom was more than destruction. If, perhaps, he could reclaim something of what he had lost. The night did not move. It did not answer. Its reactors pulsed with silent eternity. The galaxy waited, watching a being who had conquered it yet had no home within it. Darren Vale, half man, half machine, all nightmare, understood at last that his journey had no end. He was both master and prisoner, creator and destroyer, god and ghost. His power was limitless. His chains invisible. His conscience faint but unrelenting. And so he continued to walk the stars. No cheers. No enemies. No allies. Only silence. Only reflection. Only the faint echo of a man who had once believed in the Emperor, who had dreamed of honor, and who had learned the horrifying truth, that sometimes, the price of survival is eternity, and the cost of freedom is isolation beyond comprehension. The defiler of oaths had survived everything, yet nothing could save Darren Vale from himself. And in that eternal silence, the galaxy remembered him, feared him, and whispered his name across worlds. The knight who became a nightmare, the man who became nothing. The story ends not with a battle cry, nor a final scream, but with the cold, relentless truth of existence. Power without purpose is a void, and eternity without human restraint is a horror beyond imagining. The defiler of oaths marches still. And somewhere inside, a man still wonders. Am I free? With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.